I'm Paul Sham. I'm Executive Director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies, which along with the Meyerhoff Center for Jewish Studies is sponsoring this program. I just wanted to mention an upcoming event on October 22nd, our annual Jubin Lecture, which is being given by former Congresswoman Jane Harman, who was on the Intelligence Committee in Congress for many years and is now head of the Woodrow Wilson Institute Center in town. So you should have gotten something about this lecture or check on our website and please sign up. I'm happy to introduce the moderator for this talk. Rabbi Noah Fabrikant is a rabbi at Washington Hebrew Congregation and doing a PhD in comparative literature and Jewish studies here at Maryland, with an emphasis on modern Hebrew literature and Yiddish literature. So he'll be commenting and talking to Professor Oz Salzberger after her lecture, and then of course we'll take questions and comments from the floor. So thanks very much for coming. And books, as you've probably seen, are available for purchase and signing outside. So Rabbi Fabrikant.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you also so much for inviting me to participate in this event. It is my pleasure to introduce Fania Oz Salzberger to us this afternoon. She is an Israeli historian and writer. She is professor of history at the University of Haifa's Faculty of Law and the founding director of the Posen Research Forum for Political Thought. She previously served as full professor and Leon Lieberman Chair in Modern Israel Studies at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, and as Lawrence S. Rockefeller Visiting Professor for Distinguished Teaching at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. Now, to read this entire wonderful and rich CV would take all of our time, and so with her permission, I will mention only that she is the author of some important books, Translating the Enlightenment, Scottish Civic Discourse in 18th Century Germany, and Israelis in Berlin, delving into and explicating that very interesting relationship at this point in our history, and also a co-author of the book that we've come to discuss today with her father, Amos Oz, Jews and Words, which has been described in reviews as wide-ranging and delightful and witty and insightful and provocative. And for those of you who have not had the opportunity to read the book yet, I can testify that it is all of those things, and I am very excited to engage in dialogue with her this afternoon. So please help me to welcome Professor Fania Oz Salzberger.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Fabrikant. From now on, it will be Noah and Fania. You know, I'm Israeli. And thank you, Professor Sham, for inviting me to this beautiful campus. And thank you all for showing up on this rainy afternoon. You will not be terribly surprised if I begin with a joke, because our book has quite a few of those, but we take them seriously. Jokes, especially Jewish jokes, tell stories. Stories are a serious matter. In this case, the joke I will begin with, I'm not even sure if it's Jewish, but it's a science fiction joke. So it goes like this. These two NASA astronauts land on Mars, and they have all those scientific experiments to do. They need to know if there's any oxygen in the atmosphere. So what do you do if you want to test for oxygen in the atmosphere? Obviously, you light a match, and that's what these guys are planning to do. Suddenly, they find themselves surrounded by little green people who yell at the tops of their little voices, "Please, guys, we come in peace, but do not light that match." So the NASA guys tell them, "Why ever not? We need to make the experiment." And being NASA astronauts, that is the right stuff, they do light the match, and the match is lit, and nothing untoward happens. So they tell the Martians, "Well, what do you want?" The little green men look at them and say, "Don't you know it's Shabbos?" Because you see, we Jews are all over the place, and also up in the galaxy. And why is that? There are not that many of us, unfortunately. However, it's the words. The words of the Jews are such great travelers. Not just the Bible, mainly the Bible, but so many other texts and words and names created by Jews have been spanning the globe, and who knows about outer space, for so many generations now. So we have Bethlehems in America, and we have Nazareths in Africa, and the recent beauty queen in Hong Kong is called Rebecca. And I met an Aboriginal gentleman in Australia called Isaac. So you see, we are all over the place. Not just the names, not just the words, but also, of course, the ideas, political ideas, legal ideas, concepts of justice, and even more than that, the storylines, the dramas are all over the world today. The Jews have a way with words. And this is what our book is about. We take the words seriously whether they are a joke or whether they are the Talmud. Of course, there are differences in weight, but sometimes the actual meaning, the little kernel in a tiny little anecdote is no less important than a big Talmudic debate or biblical chapter. So I'm really trying to invite you all to a kind of a large mega dinner conversation that has been going on around Jewish tables for as long as we all remember. Ever since I can remember, bringing my private memories here, my first childhood home was in a kibbutz. It was not just our little family table in the kibbutz little apartment, but also the kibbutz dining hall where we had versions of Shabbat and Chagim. It is not a peaceful conversation, the Jewish family table conversation. Never has been, never will be. At times it is downright stormy. People tend to eat and talk at the same time. You know that. And as of late, we have been allowing our kids to bring books to the dinner table. They seem to interpret an iPad as a book as well. So, that's a tricky one because it can be a book, but it can also be a computer game. However, even computer games are becoming Jewish books these days. So beware, we are into some interesting innovations on that front as well. This is as ancient as the Jews themselves. Think of the Haggadah, which is your ultimate dinner table book, a very special one too. Think of the Siddur. But way before the Haggadah and the Siddur emerged in the Middle Ages, Jews and tables and books and food danced together. This is what our book is about. Now, as you know, I wrote this book together with my father, Amos Oz. But this is not just a father and daughter conversation. It's very much a father and daughter conversation, and sometimes even an intergenerational dialogue, not to say quarrel. But it is also a novelist and historian conversation. He being the novelist interested in fiction, I being the historian interested in facts. And the way that fiction and facts have merged in the Jewish texts ever since the Tanakh is very complex and very beautiful. Sometimes a fictional story can tell a deep truth. Sometimes the facts are not enough. Sometimes biblical archaeology looking for the palace of King David might be missing out on a deeper, far more interesting story which is in the text itself. So many tension fields, high culture, popular culture, storytelling, politics, midrash, gossip, wisdom, humor, so many tension fields converge in the Jewish book. That is what we have been trying to grasp. So I'll be not very long this afternoon because we have a very interesting dialogue to conduct here, but I will read you tiny chunks of the book and do the Jewish thing, which is attack myself and answer myself even before Rabbi Fabrikant begins to do the same thing, you know, because I'm two-minded about it. So is my co-author, by the way. We're four-minded about almost everything. Let me put in a good word for tough polemics, impolite questioning, doubt casting, even full-fledged intellectual quarrels. All these add up to one of the hidden engines of Jewish continuity. Loving your children by teaching them to read, but other people do that too, but we also love our children by teaching them to argue against us. This is continuity too. And the books and the children and the books are the two engines of Jewish continuity. And there are a lot of children in this book as well. On both these engines, the kids and the texts, we have traveled for 3 millennia now, and I don't see us getting grounded anytime soon. So let me be blunt and give you our polemics, just to see how we draw the lines of argument, or maybe also some agreement. In our book, we argue that what kept the Jews as Jews over those 3 millennia is not necessarily faith in God, though of course faith in God was central to it, but the words, the texts. We remained Jews through our common words. God, to be sure, is one of those words, but there are others too. Jewish existence over the ages was about nationhood, being a nation, no less than, arguably more than, about religion. It was a unique sort of nationhood, mostly stateless, not necessarily ethnic, not to mention racial, not hinging on blood or territory, sword or crown, princes or kings or cardinals or generals. Instead, our nationhood has been wrapped around words, uttered words and written words, especially written words, to a degree that no other pre-modern society ever accomplished. So let me begin with the opening lines of Jews and Words, chapter 1, continuity. Jewish continuity has always hinged on uttered and written words, on an expanding maze of interpretations, debates, and disagreements, and on a unique human rapport in synagogue, at school, and most of all in the family home. It has always involved 2 or 3 generations deep in conversation. Ours is not a bloodline, but a text line. There is a tangible sense in which Abraham, Sarah, Rabban Yochanan, Glickel of Hameln, Philip Roth, Woody Allen, Sarah Silverman, Agnon, and the present authors all belong to the same family tree. Now, such continuity has recently been disputed, and I'm talking specifically about the books of my erstwhile teacher, Shlomo Zand of Tel Aviv University. These people claim that there was no such thing as a Jewish nation before modern Zionist ideologues dreamed it up. Well, we politely disagree. Politely. Not because we are nationalists. We are not nationalists. One purpose of this book is to reclaim our ancestry, but another purpose is to explain what kind of ancestry, in our view, is worth the effort of reclaiming. We are not about stones, clans, or chromosomes. You don't have to be an archaeologist, an anthropologist, or a geneticist to trace and substantiate the Jewish continuum. You don't have to be a Jew or, for that matter, an anti-Semite. All you have to be is a reader. So here is the first tough question I'm positing to myself and my co-author. And excuse me, Noah, if, but you'll still have a lot of work, I'm sure. Yeah. How can a nation, any nation, depend on words rather than blood? Aren't all historical nations based on ethnicity rather than on textuality? On biological tribalism rather than books? Well, maybe other nations are. But the author's response, at least this author's response, is no. I think that all historical nations survived as long and only as long as they shared a common story. Each nation needs a common story. But you know, what makes the Jews unique, I think, and by celebrating uniqueness, we are not trying to be triumphalist, but we are celebrating uniqueness. What made the Jews unique was that our common story was writ in stone, on papyrus, on calfskin, and on paper from very, very early on. While others were still doing oral folklore from mouth to ear, we already had it written and the children reading it. Also, our common story was never just a story. It was never just a drama of personalities, magnificent as the biblical dramas of personalities are. It always combined narrative and law in an astonishingly unique admixture. How many stories, when you read them, also command and instruct you how to read them, and how to live, and how to behave to your fellow human being, and how to pass them on to your progeny, and how to tell them time and again and never forget them. Greek mythology is wonderful, but it doesn't do these things. The Tanakh does. It is its own user's manual, and it has been the most successful user's manual ever written. So the annals of the Jews, from the Torah to early modern rabbinic literature, include an inbuilt mechanism that kept them apart from other national bookshelves. They keep telling you that you have to keep telling them. Thanks to this secret manual of ongoing bookishness, our written text became a tribal bonfire, a hub of identity from very early in the first millennium before the Common Era. Till early in the third millennium, till early in the third millennium Common Era, which is now the present moment. By the way, it's no longer just the Jewish user's manual. It seems to be everybody's user's manual these days, including even non-biblical nations and non-believing human beings. I think that the annals of the Jews thus beautifully penetrate both modernity and even post-modernity. Today, everyone is texted, at least texted to his or her smartphone and Facebook friends. But we Jews have been texted to our ancestries and to each other since time immemorial. And I wish I had more time, but with my students, I love comparing this to the Romans, because the Romans had wonderful books and great edifices and a great code of law. But their books didn't tell them how to carry on. Their books didn't tell them that they must teach their children. And our books did. And therefore, not being overly triumphalist, there are no ancient Romans around, but we are still here. It seems that the Bible itself, the Tanakh itself, is following its own commandment: go forth and multiply. The number of books descending from the Tanakh is probably the greatest family of books that ever existed. Now look, let me go back to being hard on myself, again, trying to anticipate Noach, but not quite. How come two non-believing Israelis, my dad and myself, totally secular, kibbutzniks, who are you to tell us what Jews are about, what the Jewish books are about? In Hebrew, the question is, mi samchem. Mi samchem means, who the hell do you guys think you are? See, Hebrew is shorter, it's just 2 words. And a lot of people are telling us that without faith, it's not going to work. Maybe in Israel, maybe in Israel. But it's not going to work without faith because, we shall simply disappear, peter out into the environment. We were just talking about that. A famous American rabbi wrote a review of our book and gave a very interesting metaphor, saying that we, so my father and myself, who are still very texted, very biblical, and so on, we are like cut flowers in a vase. They may keep in blossom for a few moments, but they must wither away. So, again, I don't think that we are withering away so quickly, we non-believing Jews. Again, I must anecdotally mention my own family, but there are many other families like ours. Our family, we were just talking over coffee about it, is 5 generations secular. So my dad's grandparents were already secular Zionists, very Jewish in everything from cooking to argument, but secular. And I still have my Bible, and my kids still have their Bible and their little chunks of Talmud and their little chunks and their huge chunks of modern Hebrew literature. So we are not going anywhere. We are still around. And this is the Israeli proposal in the subtitle of this lecture. It is a humble proposal, although we Israelis are not terribly known for being very humble, but I really humbly submit to non-Israeli Jews that it is doable and possible to remain meaningfully in the fold, which is such a beautiful and rich and deep fold, by being texted to the Jewish library. Also, it does not hurt, that's the other part of our Israeli proposal, to know a tiny little bit, קצת עברית. קצת עברית, you know what? It's a beautiful language. And as we wrote this book in English, because it is meant as a proposal to others. As we wrote it in English, and I was working on the Bible, the Tanakh, and the Talmud in English translation, I kept asking myself, because I'm not a native English speaker, is it really as beautiful as the Hebrew original is? Because in case you don't know, and I'm sure many of you do know, the Hebrew Tanakh is utterly, deeply, gorgeously beautiful. And it's worth sticking, holding on to the 2 current great languages of the Jews, which are English and Hebrew, or if you like, Hebrew and English. Why not have them both? But I'm here to bridge between the 2 and to expand the dialogue in a possibly unexpected direction. We are trying not to be too Hebrew-centric, let alone Israelo-centric. We are simply suggesting that it's doable and marvelous to remain culturally Jewish and deeply tied, not just to our cultural ancestry, but to every single Jewish text that has ever been written or is being written today. And of course, what's going on in Israel today in Hebrew is very, very exciting. But then you can easily read it in English translation here and watch those beautiful new movies with English subtitles. So you are good, you are texted. Modern Hebrew is a miracle, no less. And you know, I'm secular, I'm not supposed to believe in miracles. But I have to tell you that not only in my view, but also in my co-author's view, modern Hebrew is a veritable miracle. You see, just over 100 years ago, 0 people spoke Hebrew as their first language. Today, we are getting to over 10 million, making modern Hebrew the greatest linguistic startup of the 20th century. And if you want some more delicious fare on this issue, more people speak Hebrew today than Danish, very soon also Swedish, Lithuanian, and, this is my most delicious bit, Austrian German. We've passed Habsburg Austria. On this, you can be a little bit triumphalist, you know, not a lot, but a little bit. And of course, we are also lovingly conversant in this book, not just with Hebrew, but with the other great languages of the Jews, including Yiddish, including Hispano-Jewish or Ladino, and most recently, of course, English is a great language of the Jews as well. I can go on attacking myself. You know, people ask me, what about the Palestinians? Why are there no Arabs almost in the book? And I say that we are waiting for the Palestinians to write their own book titled Palestinians and Words. And I hope they will soon, and there would be a verbal dialogue rather than another kind of interaction. But this book is about Jews and about readers in general, so you don't have to be Jewish. You have to be a reader, and you have to allow your kids to enjoy texts at a young age. This is the key. This is the key. You know, the rabbi had 10 children, and the priest up the road had no children. This is, in a nutshell, our secret of continuity. And all 10 of the rabbi's children could read, by the way, including the daughters, at least from the late Middle Ages and apparently also before. We have a chapter on women that I wish I could delve into. Are the stories of the Bible real? Or maybe the Bible is all myth? And this is my last point before we delve into a dialogue. You see, we have archaeologists today here in American universities and also in Tel Aviv University and elsewhere who are telling us, look, you know, we have digged and digged, or is it dug and dug? Depends if you are British or not. We have dug, and you know, those Bible stories, they really don't hold water. I mean, Jerusalem of the Davidian era, you know, from Saul, Solomon, David, we have looked at that stratum, and sorry, there's not much there. You know, it was a kind of a big, schlumpy village. There was no grand palace of David. Sorry, guys, you know, the Bible is getting it wrong. But here is our fundamental point. Who cares if the edifices were meager? Who cares if this is not an ancient Athens or an ancient Rome? The grandeur of ancient Israel is not a matter of cities or even kings. Material life may have been crude. Buildings may have been very rough-hewn. Clothing may have been very coarse. Solomon's splendid palace, Book of Kings, may well have been a very flimsy little shed. You know, who knows? It could have been a fable. In all honesty, ancient Jewish architecture is nothing to be proud of. And we are still arguing about modern Jewish architecture, but that's not for today. but the texts are palatial. Genesis, Isaiah, and Proverbs, among others, are our pyramids, our Chinese wall, our Gothic cathedral. And they are here to stay. And in this deep respect, the Bible is very, very real. And the human truths it is telling are genuinely human truths. So even if the scientists and critics are right, and ancient Israel erected no palaces and witnessed no miracles, its literary output is both palatial and miraculous, and we mean this in a totally secular sense. I think I should stop here and allow Rabbi Fabrikant to tear the thesis apart.
Thank you so much. Just so that everyone knows, we are going to dialogue for a little while, and then at some point we will open it up to the floor for questions. And so I know that you have lots of questions, and I hope that you will hold on to them for just a little while longer. Why don't we start right where you concluded, talking about this sense of wonder that is miraculous in a totally secular sense. And in reading this book, I encountered a lot of phrases like that, at one point you'd speak about interpreting the Bible and replacing faith with wonder. And so you have wonder, and you have the miraculous, and you have deep senses of ethics and morality. How are those secular? How is that different from a meaning of religion?
My ancestors lost their faith in God sometime in the late 19th century in East Europe, partially because they became socialist, partially because they became Zionist, partially because they became humanist, and others lost faith after the Holocaust. And this loss of faith for them was not so much felt as a loss because it was encountered exactly with the rise of adrenaline, the adrenaline rush of moving out of East Europe to this new world, to that new world in Eretz Israel. They were rebuilding. And they found out that the building blocks at their disposal are very, very good. So Bialik took all his synagogue education and distilled it into beautiful poetry. And Agnon took his Talmudic education and distilled it into beautiful prose. And the young state of Israel took long Jewish traditions of non-violent community engagement and decision-making and distilled it into the democratic Jewish state of Israel, taking, of course, many building blocks from other traditions. But it proved to be so very useful that people felt they had so much to fall back on. One more point, and maybe I'm anticipating, but I have to tell you that as Israelis, when we write this book, this is especially true for my father, who grew up in an Israel that had only two options if you were Jewish. Nowadays, we are beginning to taste this delicious menu, that you have over here. We have, my sons did their bar mitzvah in a conservative synagogue. My uncle and aunt got a reform wedding, and so on and so forth. But when he was growing up, also when I was growing up, you were either Orthodox, going on to ultra-Orthodox, or you were totally secular, but not as secular as some people think, in the sense that we had the language, the Tanakh, the Chagim in our own interpretation, the Shabbat in our own interpretation, so on and so forth, and the literature. We had it all, but without faith. So we thought it was either or. And that's why we were raised. I don't think we are going to regain faith in our elderly age right now. But it was very important for us to hold our territory in front of what was even then a very condescending and arrogant message from the Orthodox. You guys, you are not Jewish enough. You kibbutzniks, you are very sweet and all, and you are doing important things, but you are like babies caught in the web of secularity. You know nothing. And the truth of the matter was that on some things we knew more than they did. Because the ultra-Orthodox schools, for example, do not teach Tanakh. No, Tanakh is very risky. Of course, Torah, yes, but not the rest of it. It's very risque. There's a lot of sex and scandal, you know. They don't teach it. We learned a lot. In some ways, we were more knowledgeable than they were. So it was holding our territory as much as we could, facing, I have to say, the arrogance of the believers in the Israeli situation. But we are not out here to fight it out with you, Noah, or with any of the liberal believers, because I think that we are covering much the same ground. Only our Israeli proposal here is that you can keep the non-believers too within the fold, because the fold is so richly laid out with the grandeur of Jewish textuality.
On behalf of all liberal Jews everywhere, I will accept that, that offer of common ground.
On behalf of all seculars, I thank you.
That's right. And I think this really does touch on something that's very important, is that I think Israelis who describe themselves as secular, and American Jews in particular who describe themselves as religiously liberal, have a tremendous amount of common ground, precisely in the kinds of text-based ways that you're talking about, in values and ethics. I want to shift to another issue where the Israeli proposal and sort of the American context, reach some tension, which is the Hebrew language. And so I asked you this outside, but I wonder if you would share. For Americans, for people who have limited facility with Hebrew language, do you think it's possible for this proposal still to be successful and to still, for the text line to still run through us as non-native Hebrew speakers?
Once again, the Israeli proposal is not to shame you into learning Hebrew, but to seduce you into learning Hebrew. You see, it's really very beautiful. Now, some jokes sound better in Yiddish. You know that. When this book is now being translated into Hebrew. And the translator tells me, this joke, it's wonderful in Yiddish, it's okay in English, doesn't pass into Hebrew. But some of them are good. Like the one on the granny. Has anyone reached the end of the book yet? Okay, I'm not going to spoil it to you by telling you the granny joke, but that works in Hebrew too. Maybe at the end of the talk we'll tell the granny joke. Anyway, this is not your boring old Sunday school Hebrew, I'm told. Am I getting it right? The American experience? This is something new. You see, Hebrew can be, let me tell you a secret, very, very sexy. You might have seen a couple of recent Israeli films. You must have seen Mr. Borat talking what is supposed to be, Kazachi? But it's really our little secret, Hebrew, because the guy knows Hebrew pretty well. So if young people in the Jewish diaspora realize that Hebrew has become our little common secret, and that some very nice things can be told in Hebrew, it might make them also realize on a slightly more serious note that the Tanakh in Hebrew is an utterly gorgeous text, especially the Psalms and the Song of Songs, but all of it basically. And with all due respect to everything from the King James Bible to the more recent American Jewish Hebrew Bible translations, as far as I can tell, it's not quite the same. So much good literature is being written in Hebrew today. So much good music, by the way. Singer-songwriter creation is done in Hebrew. So much cinema. That all we are saying is, guys, let us draw you in. It's a good little language, and it's a great little startup, and it's growing all the time. So why not? English is not going anywhere, but let me tell you that modern Hebrew is not going anywhere either. And we are not going to be overrun by Chinese in the coming millennium. So So please join the fun.
I wonder if that view of Hebrew isn't a little bit romantic. Even in the book, you discuss how young speakers of modern Hebrew, it's debatable how much access to the Hebrew of the Bible they really have. And I would say if we go a step farther, native speakers of modern Hebrew have little or no access to the Aramaic of the Talmud, the Hebrew of the Piyutim, even the medieval Hebrew poetry that in the book you describe as so lofty and poetic. And so I wonder, sort of without access to that huge gap in our timeline between the Tanakh and the rise of Hebrew in the 19th century, is there a gap in our text line? Is that area from the Bible to now, is that being lost, and is that important?
There are other Jewish languages that ought to be remembered and respected. Let us talk about revival, but also let us talk about ignorance. A lot of young Israelis are ignorant. Some of you may know, some of you may have had an Israeli guest at your Shabbat table and realize that he or she don't know how to use the Siddur, how to do the prayers, how to sing the songs. Well, we have different tunes, but that's another point. My kids don't know everything that I learned when I was younger. So yes, there is a gap of ignorance in some respect, also among young American Jews. Having said that, in Jewish history, maybe also in human history, whenever there has been ignorance, came a revival if the culture was strong enough. Think of the Italian Renaissance. If the culture is strong enough, the revival will come. And it did for the Jews on several occasions, by the way, because many medieval Jews were not terribly well learned. And some of them couldn't read either, but there was always someone in the vicinity who had the prayer book, who had the Talmud, who had the Tanakh. So as long as the thread was there, they could pick it up again. What's happening in Tel Aviv today is very interesting. I'm deliberately saying Tel Aviv and not Jerusalem, which is more self-evident. In Tel Aviv today, rock musicians are creating new music to the words of Piyutim, of Tehillim songs, and also of those beautiful Sephardi Hebrew poets. And the music is good, and the lyrics are excellent, and everybody is dancing in the nightclubs to the tune of Yehuda Halevi or the traditional prayers. So it's getting back. There is also a mini revival of Yiddish, both in Israeli campuses and overseas. There is a mini revival of Ladino, Hispanic Jews, Hispano-Jewish. And again, I'm not saying that some of the young generation in all Jewish communities is not less than educated. I am saying that the threads are available to be picked up again, and that the texts are sometimes so good that they are bound to be picked up again. In 18th century England, which is part of my original academic field, nobody did much with Shakespeare. He was just lying there until Romanticism rediscovered him, because he was simply too good to be left sleeping. And so many Hebrew Jewish texts are too good to be left sleeping that I can see how modern young Hebrew culture is, as we speak, in front of my very eyes, is picking up the threads again. I'm so sorry, I must apologize for being a die-hard optimist. I know it's not very typical of Israelis these days. But anyone who is in touch both with the ancient and with the modern and postmodern culture has some reasons to be deeply optimistic. It's simply going on, and it's going strong. As I said, the texts are too good to be left dormant. So let Latin keep sleeping. Hebrew is wide awake again.
I want to shift to another part of the book that you mentioned. There's a chapter that discusses the role of women in Jewish textual culture. And as a part of this chapter, you pull out the threads, the stories of many, many biblical women and women from post-biblical Jewish literature. And I wonder if you would talk as a technique both of Jewish feminism, but also Jewish textual interpretation, how you feel about isolating these threads from their larger context, which you sort of acknowledge is certainly a chauvinist one. And is that an effective way for us to sort of bring modern values out of ancient texts? Does it do violence to the texts? Or how does it affect the texts moving forward?
Thank you for the question, Noah. We call it in Hebrew harama lehanchata, which is a tennis language, when somebody really throws you a great ball that you can easily pick up. So thank you for this. We've been asked whether we are not slightly exaggerating with the women. You see, this book has a whole chapter, chapter 2, called Vocal Women. But then those women keep creeping up in all the other chapters too, because they're refusing to be confined to one chapter. Now, if you look back, it's not exactly Jewish feminism what we are doing. We are simply checking how effective are women in different phases of Jewish history. And you have some low points. The Talmud is a low point. You had to be a female genius, a real top-notch female genius in order to enter the Talmud. 2 ladies achieved that, as far as I remember, Yalta and Bruria. Ima Shalom, yes, she's also a heroine of ours, but she was more of a, as her name suggests, a peacemaker, a kind of a mediator, also a very important feminine job, but she's not an intellectual. The intellectuals are, you would agree, Yalta and Bruria. So the Talmud was a low point in women's participation. It was like, we compare it to the 19th century universities, you know, before they were open to women and to Jews. You know, for the most of the 19th century, the great German universities are closed to women, closed to Jews. As soon as they open up, presto, we have Hannah Arendt, because the Jewish women were so ready for it. So ready, it didn't take one generation even. So the Talmud is a low point, and then of course ultra-Orthodoxy, ever since the 16th century to this day, is a low point. But when you look at other parts of Jewish literacy, especially the Tanakh, and since early modernity, they start climbing up again. The Tanakh ladies are extremely vocal, active. They do not stay indoors like we are told by the post-Maimonidean rabbis that we ought to stay indoors. They do not shut up. They sing in public. Today, you know, there's a row in Israel about ladies singing in public. In the army, the ultra-Orthodox soldiers don't want to be there, not even to shut their ears when ladies sing in public. However, Miriam and Hannah and so many other women, we have a whole checklist, believe me, are all singing and dancing in public and doing all sorts of other rude things, expressing their opinions, litigating, changing the law. If you think of the daughters of Zelophehad, it's all here. If you don't know these ladies, I suggest you make an acquaintance. They are lovely ladies. And doing everything that strong women ought to do. To cut a very long and lovely story short, let me put it in a nutshell. A culture whose main 2 points of strength are textuality and child rearing will make room for strong women, because women are totally capable to compete with the men on both grounds, textuality and teaching your kids at an early age. The first Yiddish mama ever who took her kid at a very young age to the cheder or to the shul or to the school and said to him, go and learn, and gave him food, of course, was Hannah, mother of Samuel. He was the first Yiddish mama, and we are still around.
I'll hold the question I was going to ask, because I think that image of Hannah as a Yiddish mama is one that really touched me. And when you describe this sort of Jewish mother archetype, you say that it consists of two things, the education of the children, the sending them off to school, and the physical caretaking, whether it's the suits of clothes that Hannah makes for Samuel when she comes up on pilgrimage or feeding. And I just wonder, that was again one of the places where I felt that religion was being overlooked. Hannah, after all, prays for the birth of her child and devotes his whole life to service in the temple, and it seemed strange to me to reduce that story to a story that wasn't at least partially about her piety and her faith. And when I think of the archetype of the Yiddish mother, it's also about the care with which religious rituals are observed in the home and the values of Judaism are transmitted in the home. And I wonder, how does that play into your vision of what the Jewish home is like at that Yiddish mama's table?
Let me do something very un-Israeli. We Israelis don't like acknowledging our mistakes. We're never mistaken, never. But maybe in this book we should have put more about piety. Maybe we should have put more about faith as an engine for women and in general. Maybe because of our own lack of faith, we have disregarded some of the sheer power of faith. Having said that, and acknowledged that, let me compare this even ancient Jewish piety, if you like, motherly piety, to the ancient Greek equivalent. Because we're trying to say something more, you see. We're almost taking piety or faith for granted. We're trying to say something more which is very relative to motherhood. You see, if you think of the biblical mothers compared to the ancient Greek mothers or notions of motherhood, what do you have? In Greek mythology, Nebuch, either they are childless, most of the goddesses are childless, or they have kids but they disown them, or they have kids and they kill them, think about Medea, or they have kids and the kids do terrible things to their mothers, things about Oedipus, and there's never a happy ending for motherhood in ancient Greek culture. Biblical mothers and post-biblical Jewish motherhood is about keeping your kids alive. And you can call it piety, you are keeping your kid alive to praise the Lord. You are teaching your kid at the age of 3 the alphabet, the Aleph Bet, in order for him to become a devout scholar. You dream of your kid becoming a rabbi or a lawyer or a doctor, which is also about textuality. But it is a motherhood that is perhaps not more devoted than the ancient Greek women were devoted to their gods. But it is also about maintaining a living legacy, a living family tree. So we were trying to put our finger on that. And you are absolutely right that faith is a huge engine. But the last time the God of Israel told somebody to kill their child, you remember what happened, right? It's just, you just don't do that. And you don't want to test, I'm talking about Abraham and Isaac, of course. You don't really want to test the strength of Jewish parenthood, not just motherhood, parenthood, against the strength of Jewish faith. And I think the Lord Almighty gave up on this line of thought after the Akedah, after Abraham and Isaac. In order to maintain Jewish continuity, you need living children. And you need to do 2 things to them, to feed them and to teach them to read at a young age. These are the secrets. These are the engines.
Well, I have many more questions, but I'm sure you do as well. And so I think rather than have you stand and come to the microphone, I'm going to bring it to you.
An interesting side question I would ask. We spoke about 10 million people speaking Hebrew. What do you think about those other people, for example, those Palestinians who now speak Hebrew, who write poetry, who write their story and think in Hebrew? How is that, and I don't mean this negatively, what is that doing for the development of the Hebrew language, but also for the interplay between Jews and Arabs and Palestinians in this case?
Thank you for the question. You know, when I say about just over 10 million Hebrew speakers, Palestinian Arabs, by the way, not just Palestinian Arabs, you have Egyptians who speak good Hebrew. You have Jordanians who speak good Hebrew. They are definitely part of my count. In Hebrew, we call it minyan. They are part of my minyan. So almost every younger Arab Israeli or Palestinian Israelis speaks Hebrew, sometimes very good Hebrew. They write Hebrew. Emil Habibi did. Said Kashua is writing beautiful Hebrew today. I was told this morning at the Israel Institute meeting in DC an interesting anecdote that recently Hamas gave a survey in all its schools in the Gaza Strip, asking the students what second foreign language they would like to learn after English, and they gave them two options, French and Hebrew. Over 90% said Hebrew. So we're going to get another million or two of Hebrew speakers. I think that language is almost invariably a bridge. By the way, the other side of the Hamas anecdote, so that lest I forget, is that how do they get Hebrew teachers in the Hamas schools? And the answer is, anyone? Who speaks excellent Hebrew well? Fairly good practical Hebrew in the Gaza Strip today? Former prisoners in the Israeli jail. So they're going to be the Hebrew teachers. Now think of this as the charm of linguistic bridging. We have, both in my university, Haifa, at my father's university, Beersheba, around 20% Arab students. That is their ratio in the general population of the state of Israel. So our student ratio is excellent in this respect. They all study in Hebrew, and many of them study the law, literature, cultural studies, Hebrew creations. So something good is happening on that front too, and I definitely count them in, not as native Hebrew speakers. By the way, if you talk about native Hebrew, we are talking about around 7.5 million, not bad either. But non-native speakers, adding up to almost 11 million now, including Arabs, both Palestinians and other Arabs.
Talking about the role of women, I was thinking about the fact that, as far as I know, the secret Jews, the Sephardic Jews who were from Spain and Portugal, passed that knowledge down from generation to generation through the female line. And in fact, I've just edited a story by a woman who lives in Miami, whose family was from Cuba, and she's traced her family back now and has gotten a letter of return from the Bet Din in Jerusalem. But her grandmother picked her out of all the grandchildren at an early age and began to teach her certain things. What do you think was the reason that passed through the women and not through the men?
No, it's so fascinating. I also keep hearing reports and stories. When you travel through Spain and Portugal these days, you meet those people who had an old picture in the house. One day they went, they undid the frame, and there was the Star of David and so on. And there's some very interesting Latin American stories, too, about Judaic legacy. And I'm not sure whether the female line, I know of the anecdotal reports. I don't think we have a full-blown study as yet, but it might be coming. I can tell you what I'm guessing or suspecting. It was much easier to light 2 candles behind the closed window at home. So, the men's territory was taken away from them. There was no shul anymore. There was no synagogue anymore. The poor conversos, whatever they kept in the home, and the home was the woman's territory. So the 2 little hidden candles and the singing. Women were always the better singers. Shabbat songs, whispering perhaps the prayer in the ears of the little children. So I can very well see that they were the ones who kept it going, the mothers. But we should wait for further research on that one.
Also, I'd like to address the women's issue. My father, I was born in Egypt, and my father was a very forward-looking individual because he said his daughters would be educated just like his sons. And everybody around him said, "Are you crazy?" He said, "Oh no, it was very important." and we did get Jewish education. And it came to life in a very unusual way. I was traveling in Holland, and I wear a talit when I go to synagogue. I was bat mitzvah and all that jazz. And I went to the synagogue there, and the gates were closed, and the whole place was controlled by the Israelis because of security reasons, with guns on the roof and everything else. So
Are you talking about the Sephardi synagogue in Amsterdam? The
no,
big synagogue? Or-
no, another one.
Another one, yeah.
Another
But
one.
still Israeli guards at
Yeah,
the gate.
right.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I walk in and I go to reach for a talit, and the guy says to me, "Don't you dare touch it."
Oy vey.
I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "There's the steps, go up there." And I was like, oh my God. From now on, the first thing I pack in my suitcase is my talit.
I want to use, thank you for sharing the story. I just want to tell you something about why Jewish women, you remember that I mentioned earlier that Hannah Arendt, and many other Hannah Arendts, by the way, many other extremely successful female Jewish academics showed up as soon as the gates of higher education were opened to them in Europe. And here we do have a lot of solid research on what was going on. Why were they so ready? How come they were already so literate that within the first generation you had all those scientists and medics and philosophers and what have you? Now, I'm also a historian of the book. I teach the history of the book, the history of reading. And we know something very interesting. You see, in the Protestant world, in the Catholic world, there was no such thing as the Bible on the family table. You had to go to church, and the priest would be the mediator between you and God Almighty and the text. Comes Martin Luther and creates the Protestant revolution it was, and translate the Bible into the vernacular, into German and other languages, and suddenly the books are on the family table in Lutheran Protestant homes from the 16th century onward. The Jews were there about a millennium earlier. The books were on the family table at least a millennium earlier. Shabbat, Pesach, all the Chagim, sometimes every evening for the brachot. So if the daughter was clever enough, and most daughters are, even if daddy didn't teach her, she caught it. She could read. Now, of course, she was disadvantaged. Her brother was sent to Cheder at the age of 3. She wasn't. Although we do know that in the early modern period, girls also went to Cheder in some parts of Europe. But let's say they weren't. The availability of books in the family home meant that they could teach themselves or be taught by their parents to read. So we have such a long line of female literacy that by the time they are given free rein, they are immediately successful. Their grandmothers and great-grandmothers had been literate as well. All this apropos your story. Yeah.
I wonder if any of the students would like to ask a question before I move forward. Students? Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about the process of writing the book? What motivated you to write this book, and also how you divided the work with your father? What was the process of putting?
Thank you. This is a question that always comes up. And I have to tell you something that is contrary to what every author always says. You know, people always tell you how difficult it was to write the book. This book was not difficult to write because we'd been talking about these issues around our family table or our kibbutz table ever since one of the authors was 3 years old. I'll let you guess which one. We were approached with a request to write this book by the Posen Foundation, which set up a wonderful a literary Judaic project called the Posen Anthology or Library. They are bringing out volumes of Jewish texts from Tanakh to 21st century. First one just came out and everything else will follow. And they wanted a lighter book to accompany this project, which is called the Library of Jewish Civilization. So we said, no, sorry, we are not writing commissioned books. You know, we've got enough problems of our own and so on. We like to write our own free-flowing books. But this time around, we suddenly felt, both my father and I, that we want to do it because we need to put in writing the dialogue we've been conducting for so long. So we sat down at home, in a cafe, you name it, and he talked, I talked, we argued, we quarreled, we made peace again, and I typed on my laptop. Some of our arguments are in this book. Others, very often we speak purportedly in the same voice, but sometimes you can, trail the arguments. For example, one thing we cannot agree about, maybe this will wake the students, is the internet. He thinks the internet is the invention of the devil and the end of the book as we know it. And I think the internet is absolutely great and a very Talmudic space. So we argued, but I typed on my laptop, and I checked almost all our primary sources can now be checked online. And I give credit to the beautiful websites that enabled me to check our sources online. So maybe he's right, and this is the end of the book as we know it, but I don't think it's the end of the book at all.
I'm afraid this is more of a half-baked thought than an actual question, but as you were speaking, something that occurred to me is you coming from an Israeli context, you live in a place where Jewish national identity is something of a given. I've lived in Israel, I also live in the United States, and there's something about the need for practice and community that you're not going to get from books. So for me, your emphasis on textuality seems to be very much reflecting that Israeli perspective, whereas for me, I feel that's something that has held Jews together as a nation throughout time in the diaspora, was more practice. So not just the texts themselves, but also the practices that are dictated by the texts and the community itself. Like I said, it's a half-baked thought. Hopefully you'll have something to say about it.
Thank you very much. I don't think it is half-baked at all. I think it is a very serious contention to our elaboration of Jewish textuality as the engine of continuity, and I think it has to be taken very seriously. I also think that when we celebrate Jewish textuality, we are not saying that this doesn't lead us to very practical aspects of our lives. Our point is that we would like the liberty to interpret Jewish textuality as we see fit, not as ultra-Orthodox rabbis seem to command. So for example, and we talk about it also in the book, in the Israeli public sphere and beyond, so many issues are dependent on our Jewish textuality. Take our judicial system. I teach in a law school. So much of the Israeli judicial tradition hinges on Western traditions, on Western law and legal philosophy, but even that Western law and legal philosophy has a Jewish element in its DNA. And then comes Hebrew law and Mosaic law, and you need to counterbalance. Think about the recent social protest in Tel Aviv, and here it was called, here you had a kind of a dim imitation of the Tel Aviv protest. Here it was called Occupy Wall Street. Sorry for this Israeli hubris, but I have to say that ours was more successful. It really was. Now, when people went out very peacefully, by the way, very harmoniously and peaceful, on the street of Tel Aviv and every other major city and town in Israel in the summer of 2011, so just, 2 years ago, they were discussing issues of social justice, distributive justice, equality and its limits, questions of the gap between the poor and the rich, tzedek as opposed to tzedakah, meaning justice as opposed to charity and philanthropy, the role of the government, the role of citizens and fellow citizens, in a terminology that was largely taken from the Jewish tradition. Even those young Tel Avivniks, they quoted from the Bible. And by the way, sometimes the Bible is much more for distributive justice than modern capitalism is. So they had a lot to fall back on. So I would never say that it has to remain dry letter in the book. Never. Textuality should make you rise and act. Rituals, of course we follow rituals. But we would like the liberty to reinvent our rituals as we go along, to reinterpret them. So for me, in my home, God forbid, we do light candles on Erev Shabbat, but we do it usually long after sunset. I apologize for the confession. So this is a way of reinterpreting the old text. And it is this kind of text-based liberty that we are seeking rather than abandoning practicalities and sticking just with the dead letter. So I hope this answers just a little bit what I think is a very, very serious point that you have raised.
So maybe I'll ask one more question to conclude. Oh, I'm sorry, I see it.
I feel like it sort of has to do with the definition of what the
Sorry,
word.
I didn't hear the beginning of your...
Oh, I'm thinking this was maybe a follow-up on the discussion that we've been having, I guess, like the definition of the word orthodoxy and what that means, like the orthodox, like the correct, straight doctrine versus the orthoprax, the correct, straight practice, and what's the difference between that. I feel like what is interesting is because this is sort of like random historical thing, but like the word orthodox was given to the traditional Jews by the Reform movement. And they didn't actually take it upon themselves. They said like, oh, this is the correct doctrine, like as in like, you're following the correct doctrine, but a lot of it was, it's very complicated, but I feel like it was a lot of implicit was that you're following the correct practice, the socially accepted practice, rather than the one that makes most sense to you spiritually, right? And it's sort of a historical conflict. But so we were really implying that they were sort of orthoprax rather than orthodox. So I feel like the conflict between doctrine and practice has always been sort of, over the past few hundred years, has been very preeminent in Jewish discourse and such. That I don't know, that's all. It's not really a question.
So I'm ready for dialogue. I think that for too long, you guys have left us to our own devices with our extreme secular versus very orthodox division in Israeli society. It is not a healthy division. And I think the more we get interventions in the Israeli sphere from all the shades of the Jewish rainbow in this country and many other places, the more the merrier. Right now, as we speak, we've had this very dramatic decision in Jerusalem following a long struggle of the women who want to worship at the Western Wall, the Kotel, and now they've reached a compromise, and of what I hear, they also agreed to a very interesting compromise, which is not just about them, it's going to change the whole of the Israeli public sphere and public approach to the Western Wall. This is very good, and this is very useful, and we have been waiting for this kind of intervention and dialogue and participation for a very, very long time. So all I can say as an Israeli, we shall keep on quarreling until the cows come home, and long after that. But all I can tell the different Jewish American and other Jewish streams of thought and faith, welcome into the fray. It's a very interesting place.
I think we have time for one more question, and so I'm going to ask just one concluding question. One of the issues that you discuss at the end of the book, and that is sort of really provocative, is the question of who is a Jew, and who is it who gets to participate in this textual tradition, in this textual conversation. And the answer that you propose is that anyone who asks and engages with the question, who is a Jew, is participating in this dialogue, if I am paraphrasing you correctly. And so I wonder if you would comment for us on your sense of boundaries versus inclusivity, and is your view really as broad as welcoming all the people who might wish to engage in this textual conversation?
Okay, briefly, let me blame my dad. Because my dad's favorite answer when he's being asked who is a Jew is, and this is the way we phrase it in the book, anyone who is meshuggah enough to call himself or herself a Jew is a Jew. I think it's not a bad definition, but I'm a little more specific or nuanced than that. But I really do think, considering the situation in this country today, and we've all read, or many of us have read, the recent findings reported in the New York Times some days ago, which, by the way, are not disheartening, I think. It seems that a lot of non-believing Jews are out there, and a lot of non-Jews who have either married into Jewish families or are simply deeply interested. Do you want my blunt Israeli answer? Let them all in. Let them all in. The way we have allowed in more than 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union, about 1/4 to 1/5 of which are not technically, halakhically Jewish, and they are now all great, mostly great Hebrew speakers, and some of them are becoming good students and scholars of the Hebrew language and culture. Let them all in. We do need to grow, and more than that, you know, the number of people deeply interested in this fascinating culture will legitimately grow because, you know, the best kept secret about Israel, you know what that is, that it's a very livable place. The best kept secret about Judaism, about being Jewish, is that it's a very attractive little culture. Some of us know it, others don't. Let's spread the word. Let people enter. Let people read and discuss and decide for themselves and redefine themselves. And I trust the rabbi fabricants of this country and of the world, you know, because I've been recently to Germany and to Sweden, and you wouldn't believe what's going on. Speaking of revivals, you wouldn't believe the revival of interest in things Jewish today among young people in North Europe, by the way, also in East Europe, Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere. And that has to do with the fact that of all libraries in the world, ours might be the most living, biting, and kicking library. It's simply a great cultural space, and in my humble but blatant Israeli opinion, I think we should indeed welcome anyone interested into the fold.
Thank you.
I guess the main impression I got from this was an unbounded optimism about the future of Judaism widely defined and the Jewish text and the Jewish tradition. So I really recommend you look at and buy the book and have it signed. It's a fascinating read, and as you heard, it's something different for everyone, depending on your own relationship to the Jewish tradition and text library. So please join me in thanking Professor Oz Salzberger. Thank you for coming.